question, and I will direct this to you first, Dr. Johnson. Why do you think so many Black women were celebrating the death of Kevin Samuels?
Wow. Well, my assessment is that there's been a recent blowback as far as gender relations go that I don't think a lot of people understand. Most particularly a lot of Black women, they see it as an attack that came out of nowhere from Black men. Like when they look at the manosphere and Kevin being the tip of that spear, they look at it like, well, this just came out of nowhere and there's just such hatred for Black women. One, it's not about hatred. That's not what it is. But there's also a lack of historical context. You know what I mean? I'm Generation X. I'm coming up on 50. And one of the things I can tell you, being born in 74, the 1980s was critical because it kicked off a whole new era, really the mid 70s, but we saw it in the 80s where Black feminists started to get a lot of public notoriety, most particularly filtered through Oprah Winfrey. We saw everything from talk shows to magazines to movies to TV shows, films. They just came out of nowhere almost, and a lot of it was fixated on telling Black men what they're doing wrong. And this is also during the war on drugs. So you had this transition point at the end of the 70s where a lot of jobs were gone. You had this issue where many Black men in urban areas only had certain avenues to operate in. So you had this drug war going, you had incarceration, you had gang wars, you had all of this happening. And then all of a sudden you had this whole new area in media that had, mainstream access that really fixated on Black men being the problem in Black relationships. And this has been 4 decades strong. And for the most part, outside of maybe hip hop, where you had a few artists that may talk about a few things, Black men, for the most part, didn't really have a major platform to respond. And even in hip hop, you really had some young guys that, may have had a contract, may have had an album here or there, maybe a few comedians, your Eddie Murphys, your Chris Rocks, but Black men had to filter their kind of talking points through the occasional celebrity that may say something on their behalf. And then by the time you get to social media, now all of a sudden you have this open platform that's free, it's easily accessible. And after, a number of years, Black men start to share their experiences and compare notes. So Kevin comes out of that discourse, and Torrin did a beautiful video. Y'all got to go to Torrin Walker's channel here on YouTube and check out the video he did explaining the relevance of the manosphere and the context it comes out of, because that's what we're looking at. So to get to your question about Black women and the responses, a lot of the contempt and the rage and the anger is because you have many of them that are approaching this ahistorically, and they're looking at this as some kind of just attack that came out of nowhere. But it's not necessarily an attack, but it is a response to 40 years of mischaracterization of Black men. And Black men are finally, responding, but it's not rooted in a politically correct movement. It's not coming out of the academy. It's not coming out of Hollywood. So it doesn't have the veneer and the polish that some of those other spaces have. It's raw. I mean, I know brothers who got a smartphone that are homeless, all the way to brothers who are presidents of universities and banks and running banks. And those are the brothers that are in this space. There's such a wide spectrum of Black men who are responding not only to the lack of voice that Black men have had over the decades, but also the experiences they've had in their own families and in their own lives. And so you have a pent up space where there's been no voice for a long time, and it exploded. So what's being read as hatred is really a lot of intensity and pent up silence that's finally, broken through. And that's what you get. And Kevin just happened to be the face of that. But there's a larger movement of men that have a lot to say.
That makes so much sense. I like that you touched upon the point of it being, a lot of it just being based upon an ignorance or a lack of understanding, because I can speak to even some of my earliest understanding, or I guess when I was introduced to Kevin Samuels, and my first initial response of it just being like, oh, like he like things like this or that, like it's not as polished as you said, more rough. But and I remember having a few conversations with my husband where he would ask me certain questions. He would say certain things, and I'd be like, "Gosh, I never really thought about that. Gosh, wow, that's a good point." And so, after listening and then starting to do my own research, it really started to bring a larger understanding as to what was going on and what he represented. Of course, we can all sit there and talk about his tone or talk about things that he said that were maybe out of context or could have been said better. We can all sit.
Didn't you binge watch like a lot of Kevin one? Is that what you did?
I did. I say it was like a 50 hour because when I looked over, now it wasn't all at once. It wasn't all at once. It was like months and months and months. And I looked and I was like, wait, I watched a lot of his content. And the funny thing about it was when I first heard him, I was like, this guy is narcissistic. I don't like his approach. He's just rude. And then like the next day I went and watched more content. And then I just kept on watching because it was something I had never really heard. Well, I'll say this. I think I've kind of heard men in the past say it. Like I'd heard my dad say certain things. I would be like, okay, or you hear men over there. But I guess I always thought I was like, okay, well, that's just that person or that's that person. But I think hearing it from him on a platform where he was getting so much support, it just was like, this is, I don't know. It was interesting. I don't know how else to put it. It was like, this is interesting. Like other people are really listening to this and taking this in and agreeing with it. Maybe this is something I should at the very least consider or try to understand where he's coming from. And you wanted to talk about, the Oprahs and the Ricky Lakes and all of the years of media being really focused on women. And I couldn't deny it. I worked in a marketing department. I worked in agencies, and the amount of times we would sit down and create marketing campaigns that were specifically geared to women. It's like, I can't think of one campaign that I was in or one think group or whatever take I was in where we were trying to target men. It was exclusively women. So it's like, I knew in my own experience that the market was very much geared to women. So I was like, I have to at the very least listen because maybe this is something I never heard, but a lot of people are feeling like this.
Well, part of the issue though is a lot of this is framed as the more we hear, the more right it must be. So we've been hearing about women for years, which must mean that they're right or their issues are correct and we need to focus on them. But a lot of it is based on consumerism. Women are the bigger consumers. So television talk shows, daytime television, media, magazines, they're fixated on women for the sake of profit. And so we read it as, if I hear this more often, they must be right. Whereas the market is looking at it like, how can we raise as much capital as possible? And so the two kind of fuse together in a detrimental way that leaves many black men in general, but especially black men, in a position of vulnerability.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head. Money, consumerism. There's a lot of money to be made off of misandry, especially black male misandry. And I think that is a driving force behind some of the things that we're seeing. But Mr. Walker, so, I mean, what do you have on the question? Why do you think so many black women were celebrating the death of Kevin Samuels?
Well, the brother, Dr. Johnson, raised some very good points. And as far as that question, first of all, I want to say that I think it's important for people and your viewers and people in general to understand that while the celebration of any black man's death by other black people and black women is vile, it's important to understand that the people who are doing that are a very small subset of black women who are doing this. The issue is that very small subset is a very powerful and very influential subset. I was online most of last weekend observing some of the things that were being said. And a lot of the people who were doing this were people who have book deals and people who have content deals with HBO and people who work in the academy. And that's the danger. Now, as far as why this is, to Dr. Johnson's point, the last 50 years or so, the black voice has been largely feminine. It's been largely feminist, which is not female, and it's been largely matriarchal. What that means is, as you said, you're a marketer. I come to it from a media point of view. It's a very well-known fact that if you want to appeal to the black community, you appeal to the black woman. Now, the way you do that is, in America, you have to cater to what marketers and business people think that black women want to hear. Right. And what black women want to hear as a majority are that, black girl magic, black women are perfect, black women can do no wrong. And the reason why that is because over 400 years, we've had the denigration of black women. We've had the degradation, the physical degradation of black women, and the marginalization and the ostracization of black women as far as beauty standards. So I understand where that comes from. What you're seeing is a massive push to say that black women are valued, black women are worthy, black women deserve to be valued, and black women are beautiful. What happened was, because in the midst of that push, the black male voice has been marginalized and it's been basically silenced to the point where, through shows like, Oprah Winfrey show in the 80s and 90s, through content like Waiting to Exhale, and especially The Color Purple. Things like that set up this idea that the black man, well, it reinforces the American ideal that the black man is a grunt, is a grunting, hulking boogeyman that doesn't have any sort of intellect, and um, he can only be controlled through his women or through direct state violence. So that's what you're seeing. What the death of Kevin Samuels kind of reinforced the fact that we have almost 2 generations of women who have been indoctrinated in this way of thinking. So anything or any man that pushes back against that is automatically going to be met with hostility and ostracism, or it's going to be met with anger. So that's what you're seeing. And his death really just gave people a way to vent that frustration and vent that shock at the fact that there was a man who was intelligent, who was well dressed, who was setting up the idea that we need to bring black people, black men and black women back to some sort of standard. That way we can create a black family, and that way we can create a black community. At one point in time in the 70s, up until maybe like the mid 80s, the focus of black academia, and I'm actually working on a video about this now, the focus of black studies, the focus of black academia was very radical. You had the desegregation of universities, and the first students who came into that way were one of 2 ways. There were the peaceful, nonviolent protesters, and you also had the black radical tradition that came out of the Panthers and came out of Deacons for Defense and people who were raised in that way. If you go back and look at a lot of the struggles and a lot of the student protests that happened in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of those were led by black radical students who were trying to get a black curriculum into the school system. And they were fairly successful. And that was a direct threat to the white power structure in America. So they had to destroy that system. And what they did was they brought feminism into campus curriculums and brought that into campus studies to kind of dilute that. So you started to see the separation of black men from black women. You started seeing LGBT groups come in and start separating that further, fragmenting that. So what happened was it started being a situation where you were talking about black struggle and black progress into all these niche groups where we were focused on gender and sexual identity. And that traveled all the way into the 80s and 90s, where what you see now is you see all these different fragmentations of black groups, where if you say anything about black men in general, the automatically response to people is, what about black women? What about black gender nonconforming people?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean those people aren't valid, but that is completely different than what people were fighting about at that time, which was a unified black struggle to progress black people. So what you're seeing now with all that is like you see the marginalization of black males. And that's the way it was from the 80s to the 90s, where, if you were not speaking up to the idea of black women are perfect and black women are can do no wrong, you were either pushed to the side or ostracized. So Kevin Samuels, what he did was he took the conversation that we have, that black men have amongst themselves with each other, at bars, at barbershops, in spaces where we are speaking amongst ourselves. He was able to package that in a way that it was appealing to women and men. And because it was outside of the traditional norms of academia and the traditional norms of the networks, for lack of a better term, it didn't go through the perceived channels of academia or network TV. Right. He automatically reached directly to his fan base. Like Dr. Johnson said, you got brothers who are homeless with cell phones. You got brothers who are academia who can't speak, but they can identify with Kevin Samuels on the quiet. So he was great. He was able to gather a mass movement. And what happens when every time when black people do a grassroots mass movement, it's a threat and it has to be neutralized. So his death was a celebration of the idea that a black mass movement threat that doesn't come through the talented 10th or doesn't come through TV that's censored with a 5-second delay had to be destroyed. So that's what that was, and that's what you're seeing. I don't think it's not going to stop, but that's what you're seeing at the result of his death. You're seeing the gatekeepers who are rejoicing at the fact that somebody who could galvanize people is gone.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
There's something Torrin pointed to. He raised a lot of good points. One of the things that hit me was when he talked about, this, this movement where we perceived ourselves as black, as one group responding politically, especially out of the 60s. But one of the major changes has been, this separation of identity. And I think it really, I have this concept where I talk about the black masculinist turn, where you have these moments where black men are starting to have realizations that things are very different than they were in the late 60s and the early 70s, and even in the 80s. They're very different moments. One of those moments I think that was key not too long ago was Ice Cube online talking to the what do you call it? I keep forgetting the name of their channel. The Coffee with Queens or
Cocktails with Queens on Fox.
Cocktails with Queens.
Okay. Yeah.
Vivica Fox, and there was that critical moment where he's trying to put forth this plan to improve the quality of life for Black America, and he hits this wall where these women are saying, no, you have to talk about Black women explicitly. But not only did he not talk about Black women, he didn't talk about Black men. He didn't talk about LGBT. He didn't bring gender up at all. He was talking about the Black community, and hitting this wall was this moment where he got so much pushback from these women on the basis of being Black and pushing a Black agenda that it gave him pause. And I think for many Black men watching that, it was a moment where they had to really go, wait a minute, this is different. We've been thinking about the Black community in a communal sense and trying to push for this generic idea, but there's a whole different ideological movement predicated on identity that has fractured a lot of that. And many of us didn't know to what extent that had happened until you got to a moment like that. Now, we could say there are other moments that echoed it, but I think that moment was so key. And I would argue that Kevin Samuel's death is another one of those moments, because seeing the blowback, seeing the hostility and the contempt that seems to be focused on Kevin, but it doesn't take long before it goes out to Black men as a whole. Those are the moments where you have Black men, maybe who aren't even involved in these discussions, who are looking at this saying, wait a minute, this is not the Black community I thought it was.